How do we decide whom to trust when it comes to scientific information or any information for that matter? We like to think we can research things on our own, think critically, and form our own opinions. And to some extent, we can, but really, we still depend on others to guide us through the complexities. We depend on their knowledge and their ability to communicate it, and they depend on ours. There is a name for this phenomenon. It's called the division of cognitive labor. But that dependence also creates doubt. For example, how do we know who to trust, especially when we're not familiar with the topics ourselves? So the obvious answer here is we trust specialized knowledge. But the scientific literature is full of technical terminology, so-called jargon, and it's often not written in a way that grabs the attention of the general audience. And science news, on the other hand, oversimplifies. It even spreads misinformation, whether intentionally or not. And that's the thing, we recognize this as science communicators. We constantly try to balance accessible language with the more technical terminology of scientific literature. And then you think, jargon, is there a reason for it? Well, there is a reason for jargon. It helps us condense complex ideas. It speeds things up. But if we're going to be honest, it also hides our limitations. I recently had an excellent conversation with an expert in the field of jargon and other related topics. His name is Francisco Cruz. He's a PhD from the University of Lisbon, and he has been a visiting collaborator at Princeton University. And his work focuses exactly on this, what the general public thinks about scientific information and how that shapes trust in science.
Jargon is essentially part of that core knowledge in that it's like insider information. So it's a way for you to communicate that knowledge. So instead of me just going and describing cancer by using like a sentence-long definition of saying that cancer is like the abnormal reproduction of cells that's not really countered by mechanisms that are supposed to like kill these extra cells, so to say, for example. I could say this, or I could just say, well, it's cancer, basically. And cancer is a jargon word in the sense of like, it's specific to this one topic. Of course, like no lay people also know some jargony words, and cancer will be one of them. But the main point of jargon is holding this informational value of like condensing information. So rather than me describing all the features of cancer, I can just have a word for it and say cancer, essentially. And we can also see that in the real world. So not all jargon is like expert jargon. So I can say dog, and you'll think about this animal with like 4 legs, for example. And in a way, that could be considered jargon in the sense that's like this technical language that conveys some meaning to the ones that know what properties the word refers to, but not really to the ones that don't know what properties are there and are associated with the jargon word. And so jargon is not special, and scientific jargon is not special in that it's something that we use. Jargon is merely like a concept, essentially. But in the context of science, it's highly restrictive in that it's something that only experts have access to in terms of their meaning, in terms of understanding the implications and all the properties that go into it. I may not know what cancer is, but I may recognize that cancer is jargon, essentially. And when I see cancer, I know that probably someone with specific expertise and specific knowledge put that word in there for me to read. And so I can infer some credibility, some expertise.
So as I see it, jargon isn't inherently problematic. I mean, if the word dog can be considered jargon, it means that jargon is relative to those familiar with it or unfamiliar with it. It's really a tool, a very efficient one, within the right context. The problem starts when it goes beyond that right context. Here's the contradiction. Jargon, in the sense of this complex terminology that only makes sense to some, can actually make lay people perceive an explanation as more satisfying, even when that explanation is less clear. Now that's counterintuitive, and it has everything to do with how we signal or read credibility.
And so jargon is also a way to signal credentials in a way. And this can interfere with what we call epistemic vigilance, right? We are on the lookout trying to identify whether we can trust people. And in the context of science, what we're basically doing is, can I trust this one person to give me like specific, like domain-specific information that's reliable, that I can base my decision on, that I can act on in any way? So if I go to the doctor, I need to make this judgment of whether do they know what they need to know so that I can trust their judgments. So that if they tell me you should go for this one operation, I feel at ease going for this one operation because I believe that I can trust them. So we're always exerting this vigilance, and jargon can interfere with that because it signals expertise. So if I see someone just throw some jargon words in there, I'm more likely to believe that they're actually an expert, even if I don't know the meaning of those words.
So we use jargon as a shortcut for trust, which has its consequences, which is what we're going to talk about now, the research. Francisco, who we saw here a couple of times, published a study in Nature Human Behavior together with Tania Lombroso that looked at how lay people evaluate explanations with or without jargon, and whether those explanations were logically sound or circular. This study included 6,700 participants, so we can almost guess the first result. Overall, jargon reduced clarity. We can imagine that part is true. But for circular explanations, that is, the logically weak ones, jargon also increased satisfaction. It created a so-called illusion of understanding.
So the negative effects of jargon are always there, regardless of whether it's a circular explanation or a really complete and good, so to say, explanation. The positive effects of jargon, which are usually measured based on this explanation quality or explanatory quality or satisfaction measure, which is essentially, do you like this explanation? Do you find it satisfying, regardless of whether you understood it or not, basically? For this specific measure, we only find the positive effects for the circular explanations. So people like more circular explanations with jargon compared to explanations without jargon. As you move and you start using explanations that are more comprehensive, more complete, you lose these positive effects, these benefits of jargon, basically. So in a really complete explanation, it doesn't really matter whether you have jargon or not. People won't like it more because there's jargon in or because there's jargon out, essentially. And so that's one of the primary findings. We also did tests, and we'll talk more about that later, definitely. But we did test why. So the basic explanation is, if you have a complete explanation, the fact that there's jargon in there won't make it easier or more difficult for you to assess the quality of the explanation, because you can look at all the content the explanation holds, and based on that content, make your assessment. When you have these really short circular explanations, you don't have a lot of content. And so if you don't have content, you can't base your assessments on the content, and you must look for other clues that give you like, how good of an explanation is this? And so jargon could signal that. Even if I don't know what jargon means here, it's probably filling in the gaps that otherwise, like these really short explanations would have. And so when people can't look at content, they'll look at jargon and other clues. We only explore jargon, really, and assume that an explanation is good or not based on those cues, because that's what they have to decide on.
So when an explanation is strong, you can evaluate it on its content. But when it's weak, you start reaching for other signals. That's when jargon can fill these gaps, these knowledge gaps. Now, this is where things become a little bit more icky, or not icky, but unsettling. What if the jargon itself is completely made up?
When we use fake jargon, the effects are a bit smaller, but they're still there, which means that as long as people look at words, they don't know what they mean, but they just assume them to be jargon words for one reason or another. In this case, what we did to create these words was just reorder the letters. And so they were really similar to like jargony words, and they were based on real jargon words. It's just that we shuffled the letters around, basically. But as long as there's any feature in the words themselves that allows for people to identify them as jargon, that's enough for people to see that as being like an expert coded word, and so to grant the speaker expertise, etc. And so the real implication of this is that people that don't really have a lot of knowledge can just test themselves as experts by using these cues, essentially. And so it's not like in the real world, people will be using a lot of like these circular explanations. But if you're not an expert, you're more likely to do it than an expert will be, right? But if you're a non-expert trying to pose as an expert, even if you're going for those really bad explanations, as long as you sprinkle them with jargon, you'll be perceived as more credible, etc. And so the big problem here is that jargon is automatically taken to mean expertise. Even like you can just go on ChatGPT and say, give me some jargon words from like biochemistry, for example. And you can just sprinkle some of those in the explanation and it will work. You'll be seen as more credible because people see, oh, there's jargon, so this person must know a lot, or at least more than I. There's a lot of work on what we call like these pseudo-profound statements, which is like you just throw in some words that are really like new age sounding, and some people do like those statements a lot, and they're completely empty. There's no meaning to that. And you can have the same when you have like non-experts posing as experts.
And if you ask me, this is exactly what charlatans or pseudoscientists do. They use complex, technical sounding language to manufacture credibility. Their audiences may look up to them. They follow them, they spend money on their products, but it's very rare that you find someone who follows these pseudoscientists, charlatans or whatever, who can claim that they are critical thinkers on the topics. They are not independent critical thinkers. And this introduces a quite uncomfortable question. If even fake jargon works, how are we supposed to tell the difference, as non-experts? And that's what I talked with Francisco about next. He calls this the recognition problem.
The problem here is because I'm not an expert, I can't really call out people as being experts or as not being experts. That's challenging for me because I know, for example, an expert is likely to use jargon when talking with peers, for example. But I don't know the meaning of jargon, so they can be just making up some jargon words, and I won't know. I don't know. I can't call them out on, that's not a real word, that's not a real concept. It's the same old recognition problem, right? You're being handed content that sounds really plausible, that may be correct, may be incorrect. Then again, if you're searching for that content, you may not be in a good position to judge whether the content is accurate or not. It looks accurate, it sounds accurate, it sounds expert-like.
So now we have reached one of the main contradictions in science communication. We depend on experts precisely because we lack the expertise to evaluate them, which means we're always making judgment we're not fully equipped to make. So what can we actually do about it? Here's one of the more practical findings from Francisco's and Tanya's research, is that the illusion of understanding, so the inflated satisfaction that jargon creates, can actually be punctured. And really, one of the few things that we really need to do to puncture this inflated satisfaction that jargon creates is to try to explain it ourselves. So in another part of the study, the participants were asked to generate their own explanations after they had read circular or complete arguments or explanations. And this task alone reduced the satisfaction with jargon-heavy explanations. Just the act of trying to write it down or explain the argument revealed the gaps people had from having listened to jargon.
And so the question here is always, there's some degree of overconfidence here. It's essentially an illusion in the sense of like people are not aware that they lack the necessary understanding for this jargon. The presence of jargon creates this illusion that they have more knowledge than what they actually have, essentially. And so the idea with these studies was to show that this was true. So that's if this is true, if we make it really obvious that they don't have that knowledge using different means, that would mean that the effects of jargon should become smaller with time, essentially. And that's exactly what we did in the manipulations that you described, basically. In one of the studies, we just asked them, they read these explanations, and think about the circular one. So you don't learn much from them. There's not a lot of content in there. And so after you read that explanation and you say, well, this is definitely a good explanation, just look at this jargony word in here. And then I ask you, well, okay, if you like this explanation, you probably learned something from it. So now answer this one question. And you will struggle, right? And through this struggle, you will probably realize, oh, wait, maybe I don't know as much as I initially thought that I knew, essentially. Which means that I didn't learn all that much from reading this explanation, which means that's probably not a really good explanation, really. So I thought it was until I was asked for something that pertained to it. And so through that manipulation, we were puncturing this like overconfidence and this idea. And it actually worked. So after people answer these explanations, we will just ask them again, well, how good was the initial explanation? And the ratings will go down for the explanations with jargon. Because they read the explanations with jargon, they like them, then they realize, oh wait, maybe it's not that great of an explanation. I can't really answer this one question. And they then become less confident that the explanation is good. And we don't really see that for the explanations without jargon, because they're not being swayed by the presence of jargon. And so they read the explanations, they like it so-so, they fail to answer the questions, and it kind of just confirms their belief that the explanation was so-so. Because they were really harsh on these like circular explanations without jargon, they realized that they were not good explanations. And so they're not surprised when we ask them questions that they can't answer, because they thought of the explanation as really bad to begin with. And so in this first study, we did this for the two explanations, so the circular ones, but also for the complete ones. And for the complete ones, the effects weren't as pronounced, basically, because there was no effect of jargon to begin with. And also, they had a lot of information in there, so they could still answer those questions. It was just those that read the really simplified circular explanations didn't. And that's where the effect of jargon comes into play, and that's how we kind of killed that effect, because we made people realize that they were being influenced by the effect of jargon. And so in the second study, we did essentially the same, but rather than just asking them to answer some questions, we asked them to generate their own explanations. This is a well-known effect in psychology and cognitive psychology specifically, which is this idea of an illusion of explanatory depth. So the ones that see explanations with jargon, they become really confident, but then they're no longer as confident after they're forced to write the explanations, because they realize, oh wait, it was really difficult for me to come up with a good explanation.
And this resonates perfectly with me as a science communicator. One of the best exercises I give people learning to write about science is exactly this. So basically, you take something you think you understand and try to write about it, simply and specifically. And wherever you get stuck, that's your gap. That's where you really can start learning. And this connects very well with the Feynman technique, which is basically the same thing but in different words, and the Dunning-Kruger effect, and the 4 stages of competence, which you can find among my old videos. I don't know how good they are, but they all relate to the same thing. While we eventually calibrate our self-awareness of our knowledge, we tend to inflate our belief in how much we really know when we first learn something. And jargon is something that accelerates this inflation. So this gets all tied up and nicely organized with a concept from cognitive psychology, which is called metacognition. Thinking about our own thinking, knowing what we know and knowing what we don't know.
This hinges on what we call like metacognition. So it's cognition about cognition, so thinking about thinking. And so one important aspect in all of these aspects, like how much do I know? So that's a metacognitive question. And so for the most part, people are not always thinking about that. So it's really easy for you to think you know a lot, but you're not checking that about any like referential. So you have no way to compare like what you know, what you think you know with what you know. And that's the whole idea of like the Dunning-Kruger, for example, on the one hand, and the other effect you mentioned. And so when you do force people, so to say, to look in the mirror and test what they know, be it because they're answering questions, they're trying to come up with explanations because they're doing whatever, then they become aware in a way, well, I know X. So that's a good way to improve what we call calibration, which is what I think I know matches what I actually know. Because for the most part, it's really easy for people to be overconfident. So for people to think that they know more than what they actually know. And jargon has that effect. I think everyone has a role to play in the sense of when we're interacting with the general public, be it practitioners, be it like science communicators, etc. For example, be it doctors, be it psychologists, we're often communicating like expert knowledge. I'm a doctor, I want you to undergo a procedure, I need to talk to you about that procedure, explain the procedure to you. And so I'm giving you knowledge, I'm conveying knowledge, but that's not the only thing I'm actually doing. I'm also influencing your confidence in your knowledge in like the specific operation, but also like medicine, for example, in general. And so I think we need to be aware of overconfidence, because it's really easy for people to fall for it, and it's really hard to correct because people become overconfident, and when they do, it's really difficult for them to realize, oh wait, I'm not really calibrated in my assessment. It feels really natural.
So we can think about this last point, because that's a crucial part of communication. Every time we communicate, whether we're a doctor explaining a procedure, a science journalist writing a piece, or a YouTuber making a video just like this, we're not just transferring information, we're also shaping how confident the other person feels about that information. That's quite a responsibility. Now, let's turn to something that Francisco raises in the paper that I think is extremely timely: artificial intelligence. Nowadays, everyone routinely turns to AI for explanations about everything: health, science, policy, traveling, all of it. And these AI systems are trained on enormous amount of data, human-generated data, which means they can pick up on our preferences. And this includes our preferences for jargon-laden explanations that we feel satisfying, even when they are not that informative.
If AI can pick up on these preferences in any way, it will just give them back to you, right? If the AI knows, because it analyzes these insane amounts of data, that you would rather engage with explanations with jargon, if you go back to it and ask for an explanation, then it will spit out an explanation with jargon. And the other way around, obviously. If you prefer an explanation without jargon, it will spit out an explanation without jargon. And so in the context of this like epistemic landscape, the question here is, we need to make sure that AI is aligned. So when you go and ask a question, you want to learn something, right? But the fact that there's jargon in an explanation, we do show that it may interfere with how good you are at realizing how much you've learned or how much there is to learn. And so you may be in a scenario in which you go out there looking for some learning to do, and you ask a question and you get a response, and you believe that you've learned because of the features of the explanation, but maybe you haven't learned as much, but because those features kind of bias you towards believing you've learned more than you've actually learned, you end the search. And so you're left with this sense of understanding, wow, I learned a lot from this explanation, without actually learning a lot about the phenomenon. And so that may be a problem. And that's the context in which we discuss like AI and the importance of alignment. So if the goal is to have people learn from AI, we do need to make sure that the format and the way the information is presented aligns with that goal, as opposed to like providing you with features from which you erroneously infer that you've learned that will make you end the search prematurely. And this is also based in other work that shows that when you go online and search for things online, people end up with these overinflated perceptions of their knowledge, as opposed to just reading the explanations. Because as you go online, you'll be exposed to these search snippets, to these bits of information like the page previews. Now you also have AI in this pipeline, like the AI summaries when you go and do a Google search.
And I've seen this play out live in my own work as tutoring students in science communication. The moment AI tools enters the workflow, it becomes extremely hard to tell what the students actually understand and what they've outsourced to this model. Because I noticed that sometimes the text is extremely fluent and confident sounding, but it's a text that the students could not really defend. And if you don't have enough knowledge about the topic to spot when AI is hallucinating, when it's confidently wrong, which happens quite a lot actually, we're back in the recognition problem, trusting the signal, not the substance. So where does this leave us as science communicators? I think that, and this is something that I've discussed before in an older post, is that we should simplify as much as possible. We should write for our audiences. We should have accessible language, build engagement, because engagement ultimately builds trust. But then Francisco pushed me to be more nuanced about that, or more careful with my recommendations, because it turns out that oversimplification can be risky as well.
So what I'll call for will be for a more attentive and maybe even like rule-based or normative approach to when to include jargon or not. Because I think the main take-home message from our paper is not jargon is good or jargon is bad, is jargon can go in both ways, really. Just imagine that you have like 10 seconds to interact with this one person, like they come across you in a hall, like in a conference, and they ask you a question about whether they should get vaccinated. But you do know that you'll see them like next week for some reason, and the week after, etc. Maybe you're best off sprinkling some jargon in just to signal your expertise and to make sure that that person knows that you're an expert, and so when they have a question, they can come and ask you. As opposed to, well, there's not much to be gained from including jargon if you have the time to explain everything in detail in words that people can understand. If you have a lot of time with people, you'll rather stick with not using jargon and doing the version you were talking about, right? Not simplifying the content, but the way it is presented, so that these really jargony words like cancer, you can unpack cancer, and you can say, well, cancer is, and then describe the whole thing. And in that way, people will learn what cancer is. So in the end, we do want people to have the information and the tools to decide, but we do want them to be calibrated at the same time, to know what they know, but also know what they don't know. And that's a real challenge, and jargon and the absence of jargon have a role to play in here.
So this is a distinction that Francisco makes between simplifying the content versus simplifying the presentation. The goal isn't to get rid of all the complexity, it's to be intentional, know our audiences, know our goals, know our context, and then decide how much jargon serves those goals. So complex writing or language might make our audiences feel satisfied. It might even boost our perceived expertise. But if it also alienates readers and prevents them from becoming independent thinkers, then, what is it really we have done? What have we achieved? Jargon is a tool. And like any other tool, what matters is that we're using it intentionally. We don't want to be reaching for it out of habit or insecurity or because it makes a weak argument feel stronger. Sure, it might be cool. We might get our audience with us for a while. But here's the thing. When the argument is good, excessive jargon doesn't add much. When it's weak, however, jargon covers the cracks. And our audiences won't notice our cracks or gaps. But that's only until we ask them to explain it back to us. So next time we're writing something, we can try that. We try to explain it to someone who doesn't share our vocabulary, or better yet, try writing it down ourselves without the jargon and see what's actually there. So listen, you've watched this, and I'm going to be publishing some shorts with some of Francisco's excellent comments on the topic. And I hope you follow to get updates on when Francisco is coming up. And thanks for watching. I will add a link to Francisco's excellent paper down in the description. All communicators should read the paper. And then I will also link to my original post on this topic, but also know that Francisco's work goes much deeper than this. It's worth following him. And if topics like this interest you, just let me know in the comments. So let's stay in touch and see you next time.